Hi, I'm Dr. Erik Fisher, and I'm the only psychiatrist who is a patient on the psych ward.
Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins. This is the only one in the room, but I'm never the only one in this room because, as usual, my boyfriend, producer, and co-host, Scott Slaughter, who I call Hun, is here as well.
Hi, honey.
Hey, Hun. We're talking to somebody who I'm really excited about this conversation.
I know you've been talking about him for like the last 6-8 months.
6 months, yeah.
At times, yeah.
I mean, yeah, just like intermittently because he's pretty brilliant and his story is really interesting and I just like him. Like he's a really nice guy and
Nice.
I've enjoyed so many conversations with him. So
And you guys have been crossing paths in the world.
His name is Dr. Erik Fisher. He's an addiction physician, bioethist. Bioethicist, is that right,
I had to look
Carl?
that up, by the way. I didn't know what a bioethicist was.
Yeah, bioethicist. Thank you. Writer, podcaster, and person in recovery. He's an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University. He is the author of the nonfiction book, The Urge, Our History of Addiction, published by Penguin Press in January 2022. This was named one of the best books of the year by both the New Yorker and the Boston Globe, my old hometown paper. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Slate, Scientific American Mind, and elsewhere. And I was a guest on Carl's podcast, which is called Flourishing After Addiction, which I love that title. I haven't heard the episode yet, so I'm really excited about that. But that was yet another great conversation for me with you. One of 3 now, I think, or 4 that we had, because we actually
That's right.
had a chat, didn't we? Yeah. So I met you on a panel. Do you remember the name of
the organization? Was Reimagined.
Organization?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. And we were, it was in November, I believe, of 2023, and we were talking about addiction. And there were there were experts on the panel. You were one of them, in the medical field. And then there was me, who was not an expert, but has her own dealings with addiction. And I told you, I think afterward, that I kept forgetting to listen for like a cue of like where to chime in, because I was just fascinated whenever you opened your mouth. It was so interesting. And I knew right away that I wanted to have you on the show when we started recording again. So, and then the last thing I'll say is that our dear mutual friend, Holly Whitaker, was another incentive for me to get to know you better, because she just loves you.
Feeling is mutual all around.
Loves you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I agree. It's a good trio, the 3 of us. All right. So you were a psychiatrist in training, fresh from medical school. This is what it says. And you went face to face with your own addiction crisis. I actually just want to stop there and see if you can tell us about what your life looked like then. And then we'll get into the next part.
So that was a bit more than 10 years ago that I graduated with honors from Columbia University Medical School in New York. And I really thought I was on top of the world, which is even, I'll put in this tangent right at the beginning, that it's such a maddening and sneaky element of addiction, right? That even when things are at their worst, you can convince yourself that they're at their best. But I thought I was on top of the world, graduating with honors. And then it was like running into a bus. The world completely and totally changed, because I was struggling with alcohol and stimulant addiction all through medical school and even before then. And so it landed me in the psychiatric ward at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. And that's a place that I had interviewed. It's part of the NYU residency program, and it's a very good psychiatric residency program. So I went there. I was interviewing with the different esteemed faculty, and then I came back as a patient, and I saw them kind of walking around behind the fishbowl in the psychiatric emergency room where all the doctors sit and kind of look out on the patients. So I was on the other side of the glass, and that was what I have no problem with the word bottom for myself. Some people have critiques of it, but that was my bottom. That was the absolute low point. And from there, we can talk about the whole next steps from there. But I was really lucky in the sense that because I'm a doctor, because I was white, because I was privileged, I was able to go to treatment. And I don't think that would have happened for a lot of other people in a similar situation. Like the NYPD SWAT team had to come and disassemble my door because I was screaming in my apartment. And I was lucky enough to live in the West Village in a kind of fancy neighborhood, and then I wound up in treatment. What would have happened if it were somewhere else? If I was coming from Harlem or the South Bronx or whatnot? That's one of the real clear examples of privilege that come out of my story too. But then, I got to go to treatment. I went to a specialized treatment center for doctors, and the rest is history. Yeah.
The history of addiction. First of all, I didn't know about the SWAT team disassembling your door. That's really interesting. I want to know a little bit, and I think I might have shared this with you. My father is 39 years sober. He's an HIV doctor, and he went to treatment years after he had established his practice for addiction, cocaine addiction. And, he's told me a little bit about that time prior to going into treatment. He's a Black doctor, but because he was a doctor, there was privilege involved, right? He was he was sent to a place with other doctors to get better. There were meetings afterward to support his recovery. Right. that were doctors only, so that there wasn't, the word out on the street that this doctor that people are entrusting their lives with was in recovery. But I don't know as much about his. I wonder, this is what I want to ask you, because he's mentioned it before, but I don't know a lot about it, about having the knowledge about addiction and, medication and blah, 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 and how your body works, and then not being able to stop doing something. I want to just hear a little bit about that. Like, how did you work the system? Did you, yeah. So tell me how you work the system and what that looked like.
I think there are connections with our stories, me and you, because there's so much, like we talked about before on panels and other interviews, there's so much in your story I identify with in terms of thinking strategically about how to go to a doctor and get the prescription that you think you need, and convincing yourself that you know what you need, and you need to massage the truth to make sure that they give you what you know you need. There's so many ways that reason kind of gets twisted in these circumstances, but I think that's especially true even just internally as a doctor. So, of course, externally, I was able to manipulate people and I knew what to say in various circumstances, but even internally, because I had the knowledge, there's a way that I sort of intellectualized some of my problems away. And in the process of writing the book, I went back and looked at some of my old journals, and the language I used was fascinating. I would say things like, I'm a little worried that I'm starting to experience more of the counter-sedative effects of stopping alcohol. And it's this very twisted nonsense word salad. What is a counter-sedative effect? That just means alcohol withdrawal. I was going through alcohol withdrawal, but because I had all of these different ideas and concepts to dress it up in, I could convince myself oh, I can locate myself somewhere along the spectrum, and maybe it's not a real problem. So again, I think like that's also why there are specialized treatment programs for doctors, is because even just on the inside, there's the inside job of using that knowledge and intellectualization to convince at least myself in my experience that I'm different, that I'm somehow special, that my problems are not because of alcohol. That happened with psychiatry too, by the way. I had all sorts of ideas about um, but alcohol is not the primary problem. What's the primary problem? Well, for me, I'm smart. And so it must be some sort of depth, psychological, complicated life story. And maybe if I go to psychodynamic psychotherapy and piece apart all of my trauma and my ideas about myself, then that'll lead to the answer. And the bottom line was I had to stop drinking. It wasn't the whole story. That was just the beginning of recovery, but it wasn't as complicated as I wanted to make it out to be.
Well, really interesting though that you're writing in your journal as though almost like you're the patient. Like, I'm worried about the patient's blah blah blah, whatever you said, instead of, like you said, personalizing it. That distance probably was helpful, to think about it just in medical terms instead of and that's something actually I want to talk to you about. That is it just medical, or is there another component to addiction? But we don't have to talk about that right now. But I do want to, because we've kind of talked about that before, but I don't know that we've had a full conversation about it. And I think it's really a question that a lot of people ask, because if it's purely a medical issue, then perhaps there's purely a medical solution to it, and people can move on with their lives, which in my experience doesn't always happen. Even if things are addressed medically, there's still the for the lack of a better word, the spiritual malady to deal with. And but I don't want to jump too far ahead. You talked about how you didn't destroy your career because you had the privilege of going to receive help in a way that something was offered to you, right? That isn't offered to just anybody on the street that's grappling with addiction, because you were in this community of doctors, that's it's good. It's really good that doctors are able to continue to treat patients, and that everything is done to support them so that they can continue to offer that care. How did it feel? You described just for a second, like the fishbowl when you were in the psych ward. Did you go in there as Dr. Carl Erik Fisher, or were you just Carl Fisher while you were in there? Did people know? Did you feel like an imposter in there, or like, tell
That's
me
hard to
what it was like?
disentangle because I went in there handcuffed to a stretcher, hallucinating and delusional, like not to make too much light of it, but that's one of the gifts of recovery, right? Is you can laugh at these things. I was on a real bender, including Adderall. Adderall was a big part of my story, taking prescribed stimulants. I took it to the point where I had my first and only manic episode as if I were bipolar. And to the point where I had all of these spiritual delusions that I was in a holy war and I was fighting against shadowy figures. And so when I entered it, I actually thought it was purgatory. I identify as more of a Buddhist than Christian, but I kind of like went back to the faith of my fathers, and I thought, I've died, and this is a test, and I have to be very nice to all the nurses, and then they'll grant me access to heaven. And then that led to a lot of bizarre behavior with the nurses, and so that extended my stay there, and it was just a mess. But yeah, I started to, in part because of some like short-term limited medication that I was very resistant to, by the way. The psychosis cleared and I got some perspective, and it was really a trip to be a physician on the receiving end. I from the very beginning, I got extremely judgmental and grandiose about how, this is not the right place for me. I'm really higher functioning. I shouldn't just go off to a one size fits all program like in rehab. Really, what would be appropriate for my level of care according to the best criteria, or I should go to outpatient, et cetera. Same sort of like rationalization process we were talking about. I have no idea what might have happened. Maybe if I went to an outpatient program, I would have stayed abstinent, but I don't have a lot of confidence in that. But one of the things I really, really wrestled with in treatment mirrors one of the really dangerous things that threatened my life and kept me in active addiction, which was this idea of us versus them. Like, I want to be one of the healthy ones. I can't be sick. My parents were sick. Both my parents were alcoholics. I can't be like that. And so therefore I have to construct an identity and a self-concept that is based around like being well and what I thought was well. And, I think that is in part a remnant of some bad ideas that we have in modern medicine and modern psychiatry. Not everyone practices this way, but there's a big focus on like normalcy versus disorder and criteria. And if you meet criteria for a particular disorder, then you have the disorder, but if not, you don't have it. And most forms of human suffering don't work that way. It's just not categorical like that. And it creates this sort of dichotomous thinking where I have to prove myself to be healthy, otherwise I'm sick. But that definitely played out on the ward and otherwise. I wanted to be different. I wanted to be special. I wanted to have more agency in what was going on with me. I wanted to call my own shots in all sorts of silly little ways. The rehab, because I had a really bizarre manifestation. I had this massive psychotic episode that I had never had before. And it's a little unusual. And on the initial CAT scan of my head, they saw some funny little calcifications in my brain. And so the rehab that was receiving me wanted an MRI, and they wanted an EEG and electroencephalogram to see if there was seizure activity. And I was like, oh, the predictive probability of a resting state EEG is very low. This is a ridiculous test. You're just wasting insurance dollars. It's like, come on, man. You're on the psych ward. It's day 2. Just let it go. I had so much trouble letting go.
Oh my goodness. I'm laughing and I know it's not funny, but it is. It's really funny. And my gosh, you and I had so much in common, the grandiosity, my inability to lower myself to connect with what was happening. And I didn't go to medical school, but because my dad's a doctor, right, I always think I know more medically than anybody else, or at least as much as the person that's treating me. And, that obviously kept me from getting well for a while because I refused to see myself. And in a very similar way to you is like, you want to be the us versus them. You want to be well, especially, coming from a family that struggled with alcoholism. You want to be the well one. You're the doctor. I completely get that. And I had that with race, which I want to talk about next. I didn't want to be seen as stereotypical. I didn't want to be seen as, oh, just another Black, junkie, addict, whatever, because I was exceptional in my mind. And I worked really hard not to be seen that way. Before we do talk about like the social inequities and privilege and the war on drugs and all that other really good stuff, I want to just mention, because I thought this was really interesting, that there was so tell me about this, because you mentioned that other doctors were like, it was like recidivism, right? After the 5-year monitoring was over.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So part of the privilege was that there's a medical advocacy group that's sort of like a quasi-state organization. It's set up by the Medical Association of the state. And that's the thing that oversees doctors' treatment. And that's why I got to go to the specialized treatment program and keep my license and continue practicing under supervision. They were the supervision. And the way they do that so that everybody involved, like my hospital and my training program and whoever else were comfortable, is you sign a contract. And the monitoring contract is the same for everybody. I also spent a bunch of money on a lawyer to try to get them to modify the contract. Like, Carl's not too bad. Make him do 2 years instead of 5. That's how special I thought I was. And it was money right down the toilet. Because they always do the same for everyone. They don't care.
So great.
It's just the same boilerplate contract. So it's a 5-year monitoring contract where the physicians in the program get random urine screens and treatment. And there are all these special channels of reporting so that the group at the top of the chain can make sure that everybody is okay. Because they don't want to just treat doctors and say, okay, good luck, and see how they do. They want on the ground, really up-to-date data to make sure that somebody is safe every day. And that's really the only way to do it. So it's a 5-year contract where you get all of this like drug testing and other types of monitoring. But the funny thing happens, which is that after 5 years, a lot of people go right back. Some people, it's 5 years in one day, catastrophic situation, DUI or big kind of like go to Vegas relapse. Some people, it's more insidious and it creeps in. Somebody is held on to the notion that I don't need to drink. Somebody is held on to the notion maybe that I can drink. And so they start drinking in 5 years, and then it creeps and it creeps and it creeps. And then I also think it bears noting that maybe some people are not suffering from addiction. And so they do the 5-year contract and they stop, and maybe they drink and they're fine. I don't know. I'm not ready to run that experiment on myself, but the same way people go to mutual help groups like 12-step programs and then they leave. Maybe it's bad, but maybe it's not. I just don't know. Anyway, people would come back at that 5-year mark. Right. And I knew this because when I went to that specialized rehab, there were people coming in for the second or even the third time, like re-upping again. And I didn't know at that time what I felt about addiction. I didn't know how to make sense of my own situation, but I knew I didn't want to be in that position. Like, I thought there's something about this. There's something about drug problems and alcohol problems that are so sneaky and mystifying that I don't want to be caught unawares. And so whatever it is, I think there's something about recovery, like really committing to a positive conception of recovery, moving forward, which is what you mentioned in my podcast, Flourishing After Addiction. Like, that's the thing. Like, the flourishing is the thing. Like, the relapse prevention is not just, stay away from bars. That's only the starting point. It has to be something else has to take its place. And so that was a big motivation for me and a big interest, which continues to this day. This is something I'm starting to explore in a new Substack too, and other writings. Just, I think recovery, it's only now that medicine in particular, but a lot of branches of especially American society are really curious about the positive sides. What is it beyond just stopping? And that's really important. It has to be more than that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. Thank you for that, by the way. I just thought that was really interesting. And I think about it a lot from the point of view of people who have never, who don't have experience with addiction, and the question of will. Like, why can't they just, why go back after 5 years when when you've already suffered consequences before? And so this is why I'm really, really glad that you took that experience of yours and decided to delve further into addiction and study the history of it. As a Black woman in America with 2 Black sons and a lot of Black relatives, I have like 4,000 Cathcarts out there who are all around the country. And, there is fear. There's fear of what happens to us when, a lot, especially, for me, for my immediate family. And that history of addiction, I thought, was really interesting, because what I hear you write about is it's about the like the social privilege that exists, the social inequities that exists, and the stigma that's attached to particularly the things that Black and brown people do, as opposed to what white people do. And that has changed throughout history. When I was a kid, it was really like heroin was like the bad thing that Black people did, but like a lot of Black people smoked weed, and that became a bad thing. Pretty much right after when I was 8 years old, I guess, like in the early 1970s is when people that look like my family started to go to jail for marijuana. And so, yeah, I want to just kind of hear you talk about that for a little bit, and that idea that the drug becomes dangerous when the people that are considered dangerous take it up. Is that your quote?
I don't know if that's my quote. I believe it. I agree with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's just talk about that for a little bit. And in the context of what you found while you were doing research for your book.
It's a really great example of the power of history, because the bottom line is I was interested in history because of how ideas about addiction still have power today, still have power over someone's ability to enter and sustain recovery, for example, or how they have power like it had over me in creating this sort of us versus them idea. And I think as a relatively privileged white guy, it's important to say that one of the important harms to recognize about the racialization and the racism and the oppression that's bound up in the war on drugs is it hurts everyone. Hurt me too. It's not just about being compassionate in seeing the way the war on drugs is a war on people of color and marginalized and oppressed groups. There is that, hopefully people care about that, but it can't only be that. It has to also be something that has stakes for a lot of people, especially people in recovery. So, one of the things that I found is that in multiple time points throughout history, whether we're talking about gin in London in 1730, or whether we're talking about more recent heroin, opioid crisis, whatever, when we divide drugs up into good drugs and bad drugs, it actually hurts people on both sides of the equation. So it's kind of obvious how the bad drug story hurts people. You make a drug into an awful bad drug like marijuana, and then it just becomes a tool of oppression. It just becomes like a story that you wrap up the power of the police and the state in. But the good drug story is harmful too. That's the other side of the coin of our current opioid crisis, especially in the early stages. Drugs like OxyContin got a pass because they were good drugs. And that's not an accident. That's not a random disconnected fact. That is directly related to the ways that other drugs during the Reagan years were villainized. So that story goes back. I mean, you could trace it all the way back. That's kind of what I did. But certainly throughout the 20th century, all of these stories about which ones are the white drugs or the supposedly good, healthy, safe, privileged drugs, all of those things combined to the point where in late 80s, but really into the early 90s, when all that marketing effort around OxyContin was getting up and on the ground, that's what set the stage. If that stage hadn't been set in that way, in that sort of good drugs versus bad drugs way, it wouldn't have been possible in the first place. And so that, I'm talking about OxyContin because that's the obvious example. People know about it because of Beth Macy, Dope Sick, et cetera. But the same is basically true for Adderall and other stimulants. The same is basically true for benzos now. I mean, people are only now, I think, starting to realize just how dangerous benzos can be. Less likely to kill someone in isolation and overdose, but really, really dangerous in combination. And just bad news. And we have to keep on learning these stories over and over again, right? Like stimulants were marketed as healthy white drugs starting in the 1930s. And psychiatrists were using them for this thing called narcoanalysis, where you give people massive doses of stimulants and then put them down on an analyst couch and have them sort of free associate, presumably very, very quickly. And supposedly that led to deeper insights. I had that. I took a massive stimulant overdose basically, and then I wound up in a mania, and I wound up in the psych ward. That's not a route to insight, but we still have that legacy.
That's I know OxyContin, obviously. I mean, I think that I can't speak obviously for all Black people, but most of the Black people I know are outraged at the inequity, and we have said in our posts and in our newsletters and just, in text to each other, oh, now it's a problem because it's affecting white kids. Right. Up until this point, it was never a problem. Until it starts affecting the white community, then it's a problem. And so we have lived with that for, as long as I've been alive. And I think my parents live with it as well. I wanted to ask you about going way back into the history of addiction. Has addiction been around as long as people have been around?
As far as I could see, sure. Yeah. It's always hard to prove a negative, but I wanted the earliest examples of addiction I could find in history. And, it's from some of the earliest human writing that exists today, I found descriptions of addiction. And the oldest example is the Rig Veda, which is the Indian spiritual texts from South Asian India. And there's a beautiful, beautiful poem about gambling, which is also really notable because it has nothing to do with substances, but it's such a clear example of addiction. It's truly incontrovertible. It's the extended story in a sort of hymn, poem, song form of somebody who's lost everything from gambling, but still continues to gamble. And even describes how the dice themselves acquire agency. And it's almost like the dice have willpower over him. The dice take him over. The dice develop hooks and claws, and they claw into him. And that's really important because pathological gambling wasn't even recognized as a medical disorder until very recently in official American psychiatry. But we've known for a long time it's got one of the highest suicide rates. It's extremely devastating. And of course, massive, massive effects on families and loved ones. So yeah, there's cross-cultural examples. There are all these older history examples. I found ancient Chinese scholars from before Confucian times or ancient Greeks. I think, addiction is not just a function of modernism. Sometimes people say addiction didn't really come around until we had like modern capitalism and the transatlantic slave trade and all of these other sort of oppressive forces that contributed to it. And those things definitely did supercharge the various phenomena of addiction. Like whenever we see oppression, whenever we see complex social problems being wielded as weapons against certain groups, then addiction is much worse. Both ideas about addiction are exaggerated, but also addiction problems are exaggerated. But that doesn't mean addiction didn't exist earlier. It was around as far back as I could see. Yeah.
The Gambler's Lament, right? That's that poem. Yeah, I pulled that from something when I was researching you. And I love that. I read the last line to Scott. Well, one of the last, I don't know if it's actually the last line, but the line I pulled was, downward they roll and then spring quickly upward, and handless force the man with hands to serve them. And then I think you wrote the same words might apply to a syringe or a pipe.
Yeah, I consulted one of my buddies who just luckily is a Sanskrit scholar, and Sanskrit's tricky, and especially the older versions. Almost like with Latin, like we don't, even today, if you sing, that if you're singing like a church mass or something, that we don't really know how to pronounce Latin because we don't have native Latin speakers anymore. So there are all these different versions. And, once you go back 1,000 years BC, it gets even more complicated. So there are all these competing interpretations. One interpretation actually has the dice talking to the gambler, saying, "Don't be mad at us." So, this is life. This is just,
right.
this is sort of the way it is. Which is another one of those
Yeah.
timeless themes that I found in the history, that, addiction doesn't go away. It's not something that anyone has ever eradicated. It waxes and wanes, but it's not useful to try to eradicate it. It's better to, just like any other negative phenomenon or negative emotion, it's better to accept and then to try to work with it. Whenever societies have tried to eradicate addiction, especially recently, it causes massive harm.
Yeah. How
Well,
do you
it's sort of
mean?
drug-free America messaging, the notion of like, let's eliminate drugs entirely, let's wipe them clean from the streets, that never really works. It didn't work recently, didn't work in the 50s, didn't work in the 1880s, didn't work in the 1820s. I mean, like, there's so many different historical epidemics. I found epidemics of different
Right.
types of drugs going back to the 1500s. And prohibition alone, or like policing alone, has just never done it. It's never wiped a society clean. It just doesn't work.
Right. I'm so glad that when you started talking about this, you started with gambling, because I think, for myself anyway, when I think of addiction, I think of substances. I don't even actually. I think of substances, not food, when I think of addiction. Now I mean, now that I've been in recovery for a while, I think about food. I think about um, fantasy and sex and love and gambling, and those things too. And I know how highly addictive those things can be as well. But um, to hear that gambling was something that someone struggled with enough to write that really, really beautiful poem about it. And
Yeah,
when did you
roughly
say
a
it was
thousand
written?
BC.
Around 1000 BC. It is just, it gives weight to, this is not something, like you said, that's going to just, we can't wave a wand or make a declaration and say you just can't do it anymore because it exists. Okay, I think this is your quote. It's not that addiction is or is not a brain disease or a social malady or a universal response to suffering. It's all these things and none of them at the same time, because each level has something to add, but cannot possibly tell the whole story. So I love that quote. And we're running out of time, and there are like 6 more things I want to talk to you about. But can you? So for our listeners, for people who are listening who don't really understand what addiction is, what is it? If it's not a brain disease or a social malady or a universal response, it's all or none. Like, what? How do you explain it to people?
I don't like clean and simple definitions of addiction, and I shy away from that. The book is deliberately multivalent, meaning there are different stories, and that's part of the reason why I told people stories. I also told people stories because it's less boring. It's more interesting to hear the story of somebody who's got an interesting life. But addiction, I really resist being boiled down to some sort of medical or psychological definition. I think in part because it predates medicine and psychology. Even if you just look at the linguistic history, that's one angle, and I think could be useful. The actual history of the word in the English language is really useful, because the word itself has been around and important since 16th century, since a little before the time of Shakespeare. And the way it got into the English language is during the Protestant Reformation. All of these theologians who were sort of at battle with slash hiding underground from Catholic authorities, trying not to get burned at the stake, were really interested in problems like free will and choice versus compulsion. This is more of a Protestant than a Catholic preoccupation. And so they brought in this word addiction from Latin, from Neo-Latin. And then the word has had all of these different meanings over time. But back in those times, it could mean something both positive or negative. So there are these admonitions like, don't addict yourself to sin, but also addict yourself to study, young man. Like, make sure you addict yourself to it, meaning like it was a thing that you did. It was voluntarily giving up voluntary control. It was like choosing to give up choice. It was like a willed compulsion. And I mean, to get back to your question, Laura, I think it's really just that addiction is more of a cultural phenomenon than it is a medical one. It's something that's existed through so many generations predating medicine. And I think as a psychiatrist and as someone who did neuroscience research and who now is interested in the sort of conceptual and theoretical basis of mental disorders in my scholarly work, I think we get into big trouble as doctors when we try to claim priority over the space and say, like, we know best or our version is the best way of describing it. Because addiction is also an identity. It's also something that people actively claim every day, many times a day in mutual help recovery rooms. It's a very conscious and deliberate practice where people say, hey, I'm Carl and I'm an alcoholic, or what have you. The sort of self-identity at the human level and not just the reductionistic level is a really important part of the whole understanding of addiction.
Yeah, I could talk to you for a really long time because every time I ask you something, you give me an answer that gives me more questions, but also really is very satisfying. But I still have more questions. I want to be. I want to get back to your, because you talked about like the psych ward was a bottom, or maybe was it your bottom? So, and then here you are, 10 years later, this very calm, well-spoken. You're probably well-spoken then.
Maybe better
I'm sure
spoken.
You were well-spoken.
I had more bullshit to sling around.
But this very, you come across as very well. If there is sick and well, you come across as very well to me, and I want to hear what that turning point was. Like what happened from that bottom that got you to what we're seeing and hearing now. And actually, if you don't mind, let's talk about that for a moment before we move into the next subject that I wanted to cover before we close.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. And I want to say first, I have a lot of practice in showing up on Zoom. That's primarily where I practice like a psychiatry now. And I'm also motivated to show up and enjoy this conversation. This is why I do it all, is to connect and to have conversations like this. But I don't know that I'm well. I don't feel well a lot of days. I still can be like pretty depressive and morose, and still go after, like you were just saying, the mental act of like going after fantasy, not in the sense of like some elaborate sexual fantasy, but just like getting lost in thought or believing my own thoughts, snapping at my kid, whatever. Like there's plenty of ways that I'm still not like fully whatever well. I don't know what well is. So, but that was an important transition point for me, is just like letting go of the notion of well, like the facade of wellness. I was clinging so tightly to the notion of wellness that for me, it took a catastrophic moment to drop all that. I don't think I could have done it otherwise. But you were asking about what happened after the psych ward. At the time, I thought it was the worst thing that happened to me, but it was really important that I was mandated to a particular type of treatment that was more intensive than what other people got and was longer. It was a 9-week rehab that I went to. And I thought, this is ridiculous. There's no evidence base for this. Let me go after 4. And there was an intensive focus. Laura, this really, I'd be curious about your thoughts too, because this really connects with your book too. And I think you walk the line in a very interesting way. Like, what do you do when you recognize the treatment isn't perfect? There are things about treatment that are not great. And also it played an important role in your life. That was my experience. There were things that were not great about my treatment. And also, I don't know what would happen if I didn't get it in that form. It was like the best available at the time. It's still imperfect today, but it's what I needed for me at that point in time. And, even just focusing on those 9 weeks, it's what everyone says. It's more about the other people who are there. It wasn't about the treatment. It was just the fact that we had to be alone, quiet, no escape routes, no cell phones, no like going out and dating and distracting yourself. It was just like I had to be in some rehab for 9 weeks and met other people that I respected and had glimmers of a different kind of life that I wanted to lead. That was a huge part of it.
Well, I really appreciate that. And because it's a question that I'm asked a lot about my journey, because people do want an answer to what happened, because what they see, and I love that you said you're really practiced on Zoom. You can present well, is what I got from that, regardless of kind of what's going on. And I get that. I did it for years and years and years and years. But you exude this kind of calmness that is comforting. And I would imagine that it was probably different before, certainly different than when you were putting yourself into an Adderall psychosis, but different than when you were chasing the next high. And so that's what I feel and I appreciate. But yeah, for me, treatment was just distance. It was distance from the last pill or drink, and I wouldn't have been able to keep that distance had I not been locked away from all that stuff, which I try to make sure I say was voluntary. No one kept me there. But I had a lot at stake should I have left. I was in the middle of a divorce and I didn't want to be separated from my children. So I chose to stay and I hated it. I hated the whole thing. The only thing I liked about treatment was Scott. And that's funny, but it's true. He's the only reason I stayed there. I would have left even with all that at stake had it not been for him. There were more than one time where I was like, I'm out of here. And the only reason I stayed was because he either convinced me to by his presence or his words. And I did not have, an experience afterward where I felt like this is it. I've got it and I'm going to stay sober from now on. It was very tenuous and I was always making deals with myself and kind of bargaining, and I won't today because I need to get through X, Y, and Z. And it ended up being for me, just this very, like, I don't know. I can't tell anybody exactly what it was because I don't know. But I do know that had I not got that distance that I got from treatment, it wouldn't have been possible. I would have died. I was at a place where I was taking lethal amounts of pills and alcohol on a nightly basis, and it was getting to be a 24-hour basis, and I would have died. I wouldn't have survived, which I did not know until I got into treatment. I didn't understand that. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I got this from one of your interviews, acrasia. I'd never heard that before. And so weakness or weak-willed, right? Is that what
some people
means?
don't like that? Some people don't like that translation. There's a lot of interpretation in that translation. Actually, a really good translation that sounds a little funny is incontinence, because it refers to like the act of trying to hold really something back, but then not being able to. But yeah, it's a term used by Aristotle for problems with self-control. It's one of the ways that he related to self-control.
Yeah. Because I feel like, and this is another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, going back to people who don't have experience with addiction. And I know there are other words for what we're talking about, but we're just going to use addiction for the purpose of this conversation. For whom that's a real sticking point, right? Not acrasic, maybe they don't know that term, but that weakness and that incontinence, the inability to not do something that one wants to do, right, or that would feel better, right? Is this something that can be addressed medically?
Yeah, I think addressed is kind of a broad enough interpretable word. Yeah, here I'm getting like a legal scholar about it, but it's true. Like when people say cure, that's where we get into problems. That's a theme in the book. Cure is very strong. Cure implies I know the answer. I know how to get you from point A to point B. And it's come up over and over and over again. There's so many examples of cures. I couldn't even fit all the interesting examples in the book. Like William Burroughs getting like a vomiting treatment in mid-century. That was one of my darlings I had to kill that I was really sad about.
Like a treatment that made vomit over and over and over and over again.
It was really in style in like the 50s and 60s, especially in London. People would fly to London, get this thing and just puke. And there was a lot of aversion therapy about alcohol too. People would take antabuse, which is, for people who don't know, is the medication where it causes a very, very strong, almost allergic reaction if somebody drinks while they're taking it. But in the early days of antabuse, they would say like, take the medication and just go drink. Fuck it. Like people would just have these horrific antabuse reactions. And because of the earlier generation of principles of like strict behaviorism, they thought, oh, if they have enough bad consequences, then they'll stop drinking. Which doesn't make any sense if you think about addiction, because people go through the worst consequences unimaginable and still continue to use. So anyway, I think that's what attracted me to acrasia, this notion of Aristotle's that's about self-control. He describes something that's a human universal. Like we're talking about how addiction is at the farthest extreme of human consequences, but it's also directly in relationship to that phenomenon of saying like, oh, I'm not going to have dessert. Fuck it. And then go for the pie or whatever it might be. It's the exact same thing. It's just doing the thing that you truly believe in your heart of hearts it would be better not to do. It's acting against your better judgment in that moment. And everybody has that experience. Everybody has that experience. All the everyday addictions, especially since smartphones. And especially if you're a parent. Like all of those failures of compassion and connection.
So true.
So yeah, that's part of the reason why I say addiction is universal and like it's against the division between us and them. But thank you for bringing that up. I love acrasia. I'm always happy to talk about it.
Yeah, it's a good word. Like, and it sounds like what it is too. Like it just phonetically, it sounds like
a rupture.
Like, right? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Like a rupture, yes, and also kind of like crazy, which is not a word that I'm sure you like to use, because I haven't met any psychiatrists that like to use the word crazy, but it that's what it felt like to me. Like it felt like I must be crazy.
Yeah. Right.
Why am I doing this again with everything at stake? Right. Do you think that alcohol could go the way of cigarettes and become socially acceptable?
Yeah. No, I was asked this question in an interview recently, and
I know I wrote it down afterward.
No, I don't think alcohol could go the way of cigarettes. Not entirely. Part of that is a historical artifact. We've had tobacco since the 15th century. Christopher Columbus actually brought it back on his first voyage. And then it became this sort of like stylish, in vogue substance used by the aristocracy. That being said, the hand-rolled cigarette is really a product of the late 19th century. It's sort of an industrial revolution thing. And it's not the hand-rolled cigarette, excuse me. It's the machine-rolled cigarette that was able to put out massive, massive quantities of cigarettes over and over again. And that was the thing that really industrialized and propelled cigarettes to such huge prominence. And so, yeah, when we were kids, like through the 80s and 90s, cigarettes went through a massive shift where all of a sudden they became much less socially acceptable. There's more consciousness, in part because of our friend Holly and other writers who are celebrating sobriety in a thoughtful and a nuanced way. There's more attention to the dangers of alcohol, the notion that alcohol is a carcinogen, that it's a net negative for most people. I'm not a prohibitionist. I don't think we should ban alcohol. But I also think that in part because of the power of the alcohol industry, we vastly, vastly, vastly underestimate its dangers. But alcohol has been around as part of our social fabric just for millennia. It's been around for so long. It's hard to imagine, absent some sort of like massive change in cultural consciousness where everybody gets comfortable in their own skin and comfortable socializing and meeting new people. It's just like, how do you get rid of alcohol? It's hard for me to imagine. I hate to be pessimistic about it, but that's what I think.
No, I agree with you. I was just curious because there's I get like a little like tinge of hope there that maybe it'll be looked at the way cigarettes are looked at and not. I mean, and there's that whole non-alc movement that's starting now, and where one of the places that Scotty and I love to eat, we walk by this liquor store, and probably the second time we walked by it, we realized it was all non-alcohol. It's called Boisson, and it looks like a total liquor store and nothing in there has booze in it. And it's pretty amazing that this is something that is happening now, where an industry where people can actually make money because there's enough of an audience or a consumer base for it. People are interested enough in buying non-alcoholic wine and whiskeys and gin that people can make money selling it. Like I
love that stuff.
New.
I'm all in 100%.
Right?
I probably would have been somewhat careful in early recovery, but now I'm just, all in. And there's a virtuous cycle there too, where because there's interest, it's getting better. They invest more in the technology, so it tastes better. It's wonderful. I love it. But it's a bit like addiction, I think. As you're talking, it makes me think that like, I don't think we'll eradicate addiction in the same way that I don't think we're going to eradicate alcohol drinking, but we can change. There are people we can help on the margins. There are positive changes we can make. And so, if we're not going to eradicate alcohol, we can at least roll back some of like the worst excesses and come to a saner relationship with alcohol. If nothing else, you can look at the United States compared to other countries, and aside from say like the UK and Australia, like we have a totally disordered relationship to alcohol. It's totally out of control.
I think that's a fantastic place to stop, because you gave us some hope at the end. Thank you so much. That I knew this was going to be a great conversation. You surprised me with a few things and gave me more things to think about for whatever our next conversation is, which I will be looking forward to. Tell me where people
So
can
the best
find
place
you.
is just to look me up and go to my website. It's Carl Erik Fisher. There's different ways of spelling that, unfortunately, but if you put in all three names, Carl Erik Fisher, you'll get there. I've got a Substack where I write about different frameworks for making sense of recovery. That's my new project now. I also publish my podcast there, or, people who are into podcasts, just pull up your podcast player, type in Flourishing After Addiction, Carl Erik Fisher. You'll find my stuff.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And your Substack is on your site, right?
Mm-hmm.
Access to it. Yeah. Great. Which is, it's really cool for people who don't know what a Substack is. It's like a blog. It's like what blogging, used to be, but there are these different ways that we can publish just our thoughts, or like it can be journalistic, like this is what's going on with me this week. But you have someone like you, Carl, who is an expert in these different areas, and you get to subscribe to see what you're doing, or what you're thinking about, and what's going on, and maybe what's going on in addiction that week. So they're really cool. So definitely subscribe to the Substack when you go check out his website, listen to the podcast, buy the book. Oh, by the way, to buy your book on your site, you have something that I don't have and I want. I'm going to ask to get it put in, which is a tab for Black-owned bookstores and a different tab for Indigenous-owned bookstores.
Yeah, I can't take credit for that. I learned that from Judd Brewer, who is a fantastic addiction psychiatrist who's written about addiction. But when he was marketing his book on anxiety. I noticed he did that, and now he's got a new book about the hunger habit. But yeah, as soon as I saw it, I was like, of course.
Of course. I mean, yeah. And I just found out from Ancestry that I do have some indigenous blood in me. That's not right. Yeah. Some indigenous ancestry, which I'm very proud of. But certainly I should have both these tabs on my site. So I'm going to probably borrow that from you. And yeah. Thank you.
It's such a joy. Everything you said, like when we met, I had the immediate sense, like we're not performing or putting on a panel. It's great to talk to you. I learn a lot every time. Amazing questions. I'm so glad that we met. And Scott, it's so good to meet.
Yeah, great conversation. I really enjoyed our first meeting. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Carl, Erik Fisher.